Welcome to another edition of Inside Town Hall. I'm Jim Cameron, your host of this program, where we interview various board and commission chairs to find out about the work that they do on behalf of you, our constituents, voters, residents here in Darien. And joining us today is James Palen, who is the chairman of the Board of Finance. Can I call you Jim, or do you want James?
You can call me Jim.
Jim, okay. Jim, before we start talking about the Board of Finance, tell us a little bit about your background professionally and how you came to be on the Board of Finance and then get elected chair.
Okay. Well, Jim, good to see you. My background has primarily been in investment banking. I originally started in coming out of grad school in 1996 at Bear Stearns and worked in municipal banking, where I worked on, advising issuers and everything from sort of larger general obligation bonds to specific project financing bonds, including transportation, clean water, drinking water, and other types of municipal debt. And I worked there for about 4.5 years, and then moved on to Credit Suisse and now Jefferies, where during the past 20 years, I've covered the aviation and transportation sector broadly from a banking perspective.
And how long have you been on the Board of Finance?
I've been on the Board of Finance for about 7 years. This is my second term. I served as a member for 5 years, working very closely with John Zagrodzky and Frank Huck, who were chair and vice chair at the time. And then spent a year as vice chair. And then when John Zagrodzky decided to step down and run for and is now serving on our Board of Selectmen, I became chair.
And how are the members of the Board of Finance chosen?
So it's an elected board, and it's what we call elected at large. That means the entire town, regardless of which RTM district you may be in, votes for this. The Board of Finance is comprised of 7 members. Okay, like most of our other at-large elected boards, there's what we call minority representation rules, which require that no more generally than 2/3 of any given board can be from any individual political party. In the case of the Board of Finance, there can't be more than 5 for any given political party. We each serve 4-year terms, or if you're replacing somebody midterm, you fill out the balance of their term and then move on to another one. So I'll be up for November for election a year from November.
And who does the Board of Finance answer to?
So we effectively, like the other major boards in town, answer to the electorate, the taxpayer and the residents of Darien. There are really 4 primary boards in town that work closely with staff to carry out sort of like the executive and policy-making decisions in town. Obviously, the Board of Selectmen, as relates to sort of overall town government. The Board of Ed as relates to delivering an education to our children. The Planning and Zoning Department, which, if you will, sort of protects and watches over the development of the town and any types of investments that are made on personal property. And then the Board of Finance, while we have no operational control or responsibility in terms of fire, police, education, land use boards, we sort of sit, I would say, not necessarily on top of, but horizontal to them, overseeing and approving all the expenditures that those boards need to make, primarily the Board of Selectmen and Board of Education, in delivering those town and educational services to our residents. We make those decisions by taking into account what our 2 operational boards need. Again, on the Board of Selectmen involves things like public works and parks and rec and our police, fire, other emergency services and so forth. On the Board of Ed, obviously delivering education through our 7 different schools and close to 5,000 students. We take the input of what they need, and the budgets that they develop and the expenditures that they put before us. And we try to balance those with the overall fiscal health of our town and what we think is sort of prudent to deliver to the taxpayer. And then some of those appropriations and those expenditures we approve directly on our board. Others, after we've made the decision in terms of approving or possibly modifying the expenditures that come to us from the Board of Selectmen and the Board of Education, after we make the decision about the expenditure and in some cases how to finance it, bonds, cash, or appropriations, we then sort of package up that decision along with information that we use to make our decision, and we give that to the RTM, which is 100 members of our community who ultimately make the ultimate sort of yay or nay to sort of larger financial decisions.
So the Board of Selectmen might approve a budget item in particular, but the Board of Finance may disagree and not approve that expenditure. So in a way, is it fair to say the Board of Finance has veto authority over some expenditures?
We do. So like ultimately when the budgets come to us or any individual expenditure on the Board of Selectmen side, if you look at the budget process or just overall, we can say effectively yay or nay to a level of spending. And in certain cases, we can say yay or nay to a particular item that those dollars will be spent on. And for example, if the Board of Selectmen comes to us with $50,000 to be used for X, when we approve that money, it can only be used for that particular line item, for that member of staff or investment or what it might be. On the Board of Ed, they come to us with an overall level of expenditure. Just when you think about the sort of size and complexity of their budget, they come to us with an overall level of expenditure, and they do so by giving us all the detail behind it. And on the Board of Ed side, in the normal budget making process, we can really decide either to approve the amount of money that they're asking for, all which is based on 1,000 pages of backup, which they provide. Or we can decide to reduce that if we think necessary for the overall sort of financial health of the town. But with the Board of Ed, we really only approve a single appropriation of dollars, and then they use it, as you would imagine for an organization that size, to deliver the services, usually always in line with the budget that they put forward, but they have the ability to make transfers from, if you will, from maintenance to personnel or from personnel to healthcare, if need be, to kind of balance their budget, whereas without our approval, whereas the Board of Selectmen need to come to us if they want to transfer within different line items. I think, the majority of that reason, I think, is just because given the size and complexity of the Board of Ed budget. That said, I think where we're most successful in fulfilling our responsibility to giving the two boards, the necessary funding to deliver the services that our community needs, and balancing the sort of financial health of the town and the taxpayers when we work closely with these boards and sort of understand what they're asking for, why they're asking for it, what the long-term and short-term implications are. But ultimately, that's how we work with them to ultimately make our decision.
Jim Palen is our guest today on Inside Town Hall. He is the chairman of the Board of Finance. You've mentioned a couple of times the budget. How does the town's budget get written?
Well, it usually starts very early when we're all coming back from summer vacation in late August and kids are heading back to school. Both the Board of Selectmen and the Board of Ed budgets begin getting developed. The way these budgets are first developed, like many things in town that we move forward with, are each of their respective staffs begin building and working with their department heads, whether it be in the Board of Ed or the Board of Selectmen side, work with their department heads to create what we call a staff budget proposal. So the department heads, whether it's the chair of the math department or whether it's the head of public works, all prepare budgets and work with, on the town side, Kate Bush, who's our town administrator, to ultimately build a budget. And on the Board of Ed side, Rich Rudel, who's our director of finance, and on the school side, and Alan Adley, who's our superintendent, to put together a staff recommended budget. And then usually in the case of the Board of Ed, in early January, and the Board of Selectmen right after that, the staff present those budgets to each of the Board of Selectmen and the Board of Ed. And that's when their boards, who aren't necessarily responsible for the day-to-day operations of the school and the town, but are for the overall expenditures that those two boards, both the town and the Board of Education outlay each year, and the policy decisions that need to be made related to those spendings. And so those two boards will debate those budgets and analyze them, go through them with staff and the department heads, usually during the majority of January and into February, such that each of the boards, the Board of Ed and Board of Selectmen, formally adopt their budgets. It becomes those elected bodies' budgets. In the case of the Board of Ed, there are 9 members there, and on the Board of Selectmen, those 5. They effectively own the budget and then send them to the Board of Finance for our review, in the late February or early March timeframe. Now, this process so far may sound like it's very siloed, and that the staff is sort of developing their budgets on each side by themselves, and then each of the boards are sort of reviewing the budgets and so forth and putting them forward to us. But usually what's happening throughout that process is the 7 members of the Board of Finance are attending a lot of the meetings where the staff is presenting those budgets to the various boards, and the boards are asking questions and analyzing them. And we're there, and if we see questions that are ultimately that we may have, we try to put those forward to the Board of Ed and Board of Selectmen so they can discuss those when they're making the decision. Because ultimately when we make their decision, we want them to know of any questions or thoughts that we're thinking about on that. But ultimately, as I said, kind of going back, those 2 budgets make their way to the Board of Finance in early March, of which we then spend time re-reviewing the budgets, any changes that were made along the way, beginning to put together the Board of Ed budget, the Board of Selectmen budget, our debt service budget, looking at the capital budgets, which have come from both the Board of Selectmen and the Board of Ed, and beginning to think what the overall picture of the following year's budget will look like. What will the effect be on taxation? How much will we raise to fund those budgets via taxes? How much might we use from cash that we have on hand in the general fund? What items we might issue bonds to finance, typically the larger capital items. And in certain cases, as you've seen over the past couple of years, whether it be state or federal grants, which have come along to provide for certain expenditures, we might look at which one of those can be funded via grants.
And then once the Board of Finance has approved what was the budget as that was submitted by the Board of Education or the Board of Selectmen, or modified it slightly, it then moves to the RTM. But during your review process, there is already a liaison with the representative town meeting Finance and Budget Committee, which is watching your work and doing what? Giving you input, asking questions?
Yeah, that's a good point. I think when we look at the budgets, both on the Board of Ed side and the Board of Selectmen side, we kind of break them down into different operational categories. And we divide up, while the entire Board of Finance is responsible for all the budgets we vote on, we all cast one vote. We somewhat specialize in different areas, given either levels of interest, background, or historical knowledge around that area. And what we do is when our Board of 7 divvies up those lead responsibilities, we work with members of the RTM, most notably the Finance and Budget Committee, who usually takes the lead on the entire budget, but also the Education Committee and Public Works and Parks and Rec. And we team up with members of those respective committees and discuss our views on the budget with them as we're hearing them from the Board of Ed and the Board of Selectmen, as we're beginning to do our own work to make decisions on how we might either approve, adjust, or defer certain items. We work with them so that when we're making decisions, they reflect not only what we've heard from the boards ahead of us, but what we think the RTM wants in a budget. And so, they offer a very unique perspective. And while they kind of come last in the process of ultimately approving the overall budget, we make sure that their input is heard, throughout our process. And frankly, I should go back during the Board of Selectmen and the Board of Ed reviews. They also listen intently to what members of the RTM have to say, questions they may have on different aspects of their budget.
And part of that is to expedite the RTM's review process. So it doesn't arrive with surprises in front of the RTM, so that they're privy to the development of the budget itself, and it may make it easier for them to look at the budget and decide to vote on it. And the RTM, in interest of full disclosure, I'm a member of the RTM, not on finance and budget for sure. But the RTM, as you say, gets the final say. Now, can they cut a budget item, or can they add money to a budget item? What power does the RTM have?
So, while the RTM has the ultimate power in approving or not approving any type of, significant expenditure, the decisions that they can make are a little bit limited versus what the Board of Finance and even the Board of Selectmen and Board of Education can make. And so, for instance, when the Board of Finance is reviewing the budget, we can actually decide to reduce the budget, or in many cases, reduce the increase in the budget, or actually increase the budget if we think more funds need to be shifted into a certain type of investment or operating category. When we send the overall budget to the RTM, they're only permitted to reduce the Board of Ed's budget, approve or reduce the Board of Ed's budget. And on the RTM, on the Board of Selectmen side, they can either approve or reduce specific line items, just like the Board of Finance can on the Board of Selectmen side. And so, they have a little bit less input in that they can't increase the budget, and they have a little bit limited authority in terms of, how we fund the budget. A lot of what we talk about on the budget side and what attracts all the headlines are where we're spending money, right? Between school and public services, and between personnel and capital investments and technology investments. There's not as much sort of discussion around how we actually fund those. So as I mentioned, the Board of Finance makes decisions in terms of how much might we fund from cash that we have on hand, or how much might we take out of the budget and bond. Those type of funding decisions, in terms of allocating the sources of the budget, not the RTM has limited ability to change those. They can reduce them, but they can't necessarily make the same type of adjustments to the mix of how we actually fund our budgets.
Jim Palen, our guest today on Inside Town Hall. He's the chairman of the Board of Finance, and we're talking about the town's budget writing and budget approval and review process. So the RTM approves the budget. And have you made a decision before that final vote on how you're going to fund the budget, whether it's through taxes or bonding, et cetera?
Yeah, so we send the budgets, the Board of Selectmen and the Board of Finance budget the Board of Selectmen and the Board of Education budget to the RTM, and we're sending it with a mix of what the sources of funding are going to be. So we say this much is going to be funded from bonding, this much from cash that we might have on hand, usually which is driven by excesses that our boards had from the prior year, what we might fund from grants, and then the last piece, if you will, the plug, is how much we need to tax the taxpayer for. So we take, and that determines the ultimate mill rate, which is the amount of taxes you pay per assessed value of your home. We take all of that and send that to the RTM, generally as a package. Now, if the RTM were to make adjustments to some of the expenditures, which might bring down the necessary financing, that could ultimately adjust the mill rate downward, but it can't be adjusted upward again.
What's a capital expense?
So generally, capital expenses are longer term investments in our infrastructure. So that could include purchasing property, building a building. They're generally improvements, heavy maintenance vehicles, generally things that are greater than $50,000 and things that generally have a useful life of more than 3 years.
And the reason you bond those is that it's not fair in one particular year to make taxpayers pay for that large purchase. You spread it out over the useful life of the purchase.
Yes, but I want to draw like an important distinction between a capital item and a bonded capital item. Capital items are generally longer lived assets, something you can touch and feel and that will be around for the next fiscal year.
Like a new fire engine, for example.
Exactly, for a new fire engine or a pickup truck, if you will. Those are capital items and treated a little bit different on our balance sheet than an operating expense, which would be like a personnel expense, oil, salt for the roads and things like that. When we make the decision about whether we want to pay cash for a capital item or bond it, we usually look at capital items that are longer, that cost more than $500,000 and that have a useful life of more than 5 years. And so examples like that are fire trucks. Examples are some of the larger improvements we're making as part of the HHR project. If we were redoing a roof on a school that generally has a 20 to 30 year life, that's something we would look to bond. But we try not to bond smaller, shorter lived assets. And you're right, the purpose behind that is, in terms of there are two things we look to accomplish, or three things I should say, in overseeing the finances of the town. We want to be fiscally responsible to all of our taxpayers while making sure we fund all of our necessary services. We want to have smooth taxes. We don't want 1 year where taxes spike up and the next year taxes might drop. So we don't want to, if you will, pay cash for a fire truck or a $3 or $4 million investment in one of our facilities 1 year, which would drive up the mill rate, and then next year have it drop down. I think when people are looking to at the health of a town and looking to call Darien home, they look at our taxes. I think most people want to see low taxes, but they want to see fully funded services. And I think they want to see steady taxes. They don't want to see increases and decreases that are unpredictable, because taxes are a large portion of people's annual budgets, from a household perspective. And I think they want to be able to plan for those expenditures.
One of the people that we see sitting up on the dais at Board of Finance meetings is not a member of the Board of Finance. Jennifer Charneski. Who is she and what does she do?
Jen Charneski is our finance director, and she's effectively the CFO of the town side of our budget, if you will, which involves approximately about 200 employees if you add up all emergency services and public works and so forth like that. And it's analogous to, on the Board of Ed side, we have Richard Rudel, who you see at many of the Board of Ed meetings, who's effectively the CFO and finance director for the Board of Education. Jen plays a very important, if not the most important part of our overall role. She works with all of the staff, all the department heads, to basically oversee all of the accounting in town. And she's sort of the first stop when different department heads need money or are developing their budgets or need some type of transfer. She works with them to make sure that everything's being done properly, accounted for properly, and works with them to sort of write up and provide the necessary information to us if we need to make a decision as relates to an expenditure. She's our front person as it relates to the rating agencies. Every year we're reviewed by the rating agencies, typically ahead of our bonding. And she works with them to go through all of our credit ratings, our overall expenditures, bonding, and so forth like that. And she's the front person there. Jen also works close with us and others as it relates to negotiating labor contracts with the different pools on the town side and so forth. And she's at each of our meetings because she's really the person, the full-time lead of our town that manages our finances. She's currently working with our auditors on our fiscal 2021 audit. 22 audit. And so she's a very important role, and I don't think we could do the job that we do without her.
She's amazing. She's a walking database.
Yeah,
So
and I
knows
think
the answers to many questions.
Yeah, and I'd be remiss if I didn't, give similar accolades to, Rich Rudel on the Board of Ed side in terms of, it's a large budget, $110 million. And I think he, as well as Jen, do a great job in terms of boiling down, tracking, and keeping us abreast of what the moving pieces are in our budgets.
We have just a couple minutes left with our guest today, Jim Palen, who's the chairman of the Board of Finance. We're recording this in mid-August of 2022. Can you just give us a quick snapshot on how the town's finances look right now? Are we sitting on a fair amount of cash? Do we have a rainy day fund? Are taxes getting paid at the rate that we need to bring in the income?
Yeah, so I'd say from a high level, Darien's extremely fiscally healthy. We have one of the lowest property tax rates in all of Connecticut. If you look at our overall mill rate, we're in the bottom 5%, typically. Now part of that is driven by the fact that we have a $12 billion grand list, the appraised value of all the real estate in town, which 70% of which is just over $8 billion. You may have noticed that there's been a lot of big projects going on over the past 3 years, most notably the new Oxford School, which is set to come online this fall. That was a $60 million investment. We approved about $77 million of overall funding for the Holmes, Hindley, and
Royal
schools to have significant renovations done there, including the removal of the portables. And then, most recently, we approved about $103 million for the acquisition of the property known as Great Island. As part of that, and ahead of bonding, which we expect to do later this fall, we just had a meeting with the rating agencies. Everything looks good. We continue to maintain a AAA rating from Moody's. We're one of, I believe, 17 towns in Connecticut, which has 169 different towns that has that accolade. And I think that's a very important tool for us. Having a AAA rating, or even being in the very high AA category, allows us to fund these large investments, whether it be schools, land purchases, a new police station, our parks and beaches and so forth. It allows us ready access to the capital markets to make long-term borrowings between 20 and 30 years at what is very attractive rates given our credit metrics.
Let me just check. I think you just made a piece of news, which I had not heard. Are you saying that the rating agencies have sustained the town's AAA rating, knowing the purchase of Great Island is underway?
Correct. We in preparation for having to bond, the purchase of Great Island, we've had discussions with the rating agencies, and while no formal credit rating is issued until we actually go to market, they looked at the bonding which we just completed for Oxford, the HHR, which was approved in early June, and the Great Island, and everything is pointing towards us continuing to maintain our AAA rating.
And how do we do that given the amount of money that we're spending? Is it because the rating agencies know that people that live in town have deep pockets, if necessary, to have you reach into?
Well, one of the things they look at is our source of funding. And because about 90% of our funding comes from property taxes, residential property taxes, and when they look further to the ultimate sort of obligors, which are residents of our town, they look at the average income levels of residents in Darien. They look at our historical tax collection, which is in the 99.9% collection rate in terms of each year, and then those taxes that 0.1%. Our tax collector works over the following year to collect and does collect most of that. They look at our ability to collect taxes, and they look at what our mill rate is as a percentage of, as I mentioned, our $12 billion worth of real estate here in town. And that's one of the factors that drives our AAA rating. Other things they look at is the overall level of our budget growth. And because I think we've done a good job in maintaining, revaluation held constant, but relatively small budget increases. And I give a lot of that credit ultimately to the Board of Selectmen and to the Board of Education, who ultimately are running the schools in our town services, right? In terms of what they've done to keep their budgets down. But ultimately, we also make adjustments when necessary to keep those down. And so having that sort of, very controlled and measured growth in our budgets helps us. And then we also maintain, you mentioned before, a rainy day fund, our general fund, okay, which is our sort of unspent, unallocated balances of cash, stand at just over 26 million. And when you look at that as a portion of our overall budgeted revenues, if you will, about $140 million, that percentage, okay, which ranges from sort of 15 to 18% year to year, okay, that also gives rating agencies the confidence that we have the ability to meet unexpected things that might come along. If you look during COVID, we did a lot of things great here in town, and certain things were deferred and so forth. But certainly for example, on the Board of Ed side, they had a number of unexpected expenses that came their way, and we dipped into that rainy day fund to fund those, to give them the funding to make sure that they could get the school year through the end safely. At the end of the year, we received a lot of federal aid, of which that money came back. But having that sort of rainy day fund is key towards, is another one of the metrics that the rating agencies look at.
Well, let's leave it on that positive note. Jim Palen, the chairman of the Board of Finance, our guest today on Inside Town Hall. Thank you very much for your time, Jim. Appreciate you joining us, and we'll look forward to seeing you on TV 79.
Thanks, Jim, and thanks to you and the Channel 79 team and all that you do. I think your coverage of all of these various meetings from all of our town boards certainly makes our job easier, and gives me and others flexibility to watch a lot of these meetings on the go on an airplane, and allows us to kind of keep a good pulse on what's going on. So thank you.
Great. Our pleasure to do that. And I want to thank you, our viewers, for watching TV 79 and another edition of Inside Town Hall.